So to build the ability to remember a user, we're going to have to modify quite a few things. But to start with, we're going to modify the form to allow a checkbox to be ticked in order to detect whether the user actually wants to be remembered or not. So let's go ahead and modify the login form itself. We're going to create a new field, so exactly like we've done already. This time we're going to encase the label, or encase the input within the label just so the text is clickable, and we'll demonstrate that in a moment. So I'm going to call this remember. I'm going to have an input type of checkbox, and the name of this is going to be remember, and the ID of this again is going to be remember, and afterwards we'll just add the text remember me. So now this looks like the following. We can click on the text to do the checkbox, just makes it a little easier to tap, and we can detect this within the code at the top, and we'll pass this through to our login functionality. So what we're also going to do here is, well, we'll see, create a remember variable, and what we want to do is detect whether we have this input remember and if it equals on or not. So we're going to use a ternary operator just to say input get remember, and does this equal on? If it equals on, then we want to pass true, otherwise we want to pass false, and we're going to pass that through into our login method. So once we've done that, let's head over to our user class, and we want an additional argument to be passed here, and inside here we want a check to see if remember is true or false. So that's the easy part. Now comes the sort of checking things, generating hashes and storing cookies and things like that. Now to do this, we're going to have to build a cookie, basic cookie functionality, which works more or less the same as the input, but obviously cookies are set slightly different than sessions, and they're a little harder to set. Let's go ahead and just build this functionality because it ties in to what we're doing quite nicely, and then also gives us the ability to use this cookie helper at another point. So we're going to create, again, this just consists of static methods, and this one is going to be exists, so we want to check whether a cookie actually exists or not. So it's exactly the same as the session one. We're just going to check if is set $_cookie, $_cookie, and the name that we've defined, is that set? Yes, if it is, we'll pass true, otherwise we'll pass false. We now want to be able to get the value of a cookie. Extremely important, so we're going to have a method called get, and we're obviously going to have to define a name here, and that's just going to return $_cookie name. Okay, so we're also going to want to delete a cookie, but we can't really do this until we've created the delete. We're not going to be able to do this until we have generated the put functionality. The reason being is that to delete a cookie, we don't just unset it, we reset it with a negative value and a null or an empty string or something like that. So we'll go ahead and create the put method to basically create a cookie, and we're going to be able to define a name, a value, and an expiry. So in this case, we're going to say if something happens, so we're going to set the cookie here, and we'll pass the parameters in here in just a moment. If that works, we're going to return true, and otherwise we're going to return false down here. So to set a cookie, we pass a name, we pass a value, we pass the expiry time, which needs to be appended to the current time. So we always say time plus expiry, and that's defined in seconds, and we also need the path as well, so we're just going to say so at the current domain kind of thing. So that is our functionality. Now to delete a cookie, fairly straightforward. We just say self put, because we've already created our method. We just put the name that we want, so we're basically replacing a cookie with an empty string and time -1, and that's it. That's all we need to do. That is our cookie class. So now what we're going to do is move on to actually using this to set a cookie to determine if the user should be logged in constantly or not. We've got a few properties or a few values here that we've stored in our config. So that's the remember one. So we have the cookie name for the remember and the cookie expiry as well. So how long the session, if they want it to be remembered, should expire. So if remember, well, what do we want to do? Well, we want to be able to actually generate a hash, check that the hash doesn't already exist in the database or not, and then insert this hash into the database. And that will be looked up every time this user visits the page, because they'll have a cookie set, which obviously will be stored on the computer. So this is slightly tricky, but this is how it's going to work. So we're going to generate a hash, and we want to say hash unique because we've already created that functionality here. It just returned this make function with a unique ID. So we want to generate a unique hash. We want a hash check. So we want to check if this has been stored in the database or not. And remember, we created this, if we go to the login register thing. So we created this user session table, a user session table, and that contained a user ID, a hash. So if, for example, I come along to the website, I sign in and I want click remember me, what it's going to do is it's going to store a cookie with a hash value, and then it's also going to store it in the database with my user ID. So the next time I visit the website on the computer with that cookie stored on my computer, it will look up in the database, and we'll do all of that inside of the initialization file in the core folder. It will look up that value and it will assign my user ID into the session and automatically log me in. So that's basically how this is going to work. We're storing a list of people's hashes in a database. So inside of back to our code, the hash check is going to say this db, and we're going to get from users session where the user ID equals this data ID. So we're basically checking if we already have a hash stored in the database, which we shouldn't, because when we log out, we don't want to keep this in the database. We'll remove it at some point. So we'll go back to that in the logout functionality in a moment. So if we don't have any hash in the database, so if hash check count returns 0, we then want to insert a record into the database. So insert array. So we have a user ID and we have a hash. So we want to put this into the database then. So this is going to be this data ID, and the hash is going to be just the hash that we generated up here. So once we've done that, or otherwise, we want to set the hash equal to hash check first hash. Now this might look confusing. We've written quite a lot of functionality here. So let's just run through with this. If we go over to our login page, if I hit remember me and click login, what's going to happen is inside of our code on the login page, we're going to return true or false here, and we're going to return true to our login method. So our login method is then going to say if remember, yes, so run all this functionality. So as long as we've ticked that checkbox, all of this will be run. So we generate a hash. We then check inside of our database in fact, we don't really need to do this here, to be honest. We should really be doing this inside of here. But nevertheless, we perform a check to see if our user ID exists in this database table already here. If it does, it'll assume that we've already been assigned a session at some point, even though it should have really been deleted. But nevertheless, we account for these different circumstances. So if that's the case, if it doesn't exist, we go ahead and insert a hash into the database, because basically we don't want more than one hash being assigned to a user ID. So if we have duplicate records, then we get into a bit of a mess. We only ever want one record in this table per user. And there are other ways, of course, of doing this, but we're just going to do it in this way for now. So we then insert the user ID that we're currently logged in as. And what we then do is we store the hash as well. Otherwise, we set the hash to the hash that's already in the database. So we just set the hash to that. Now what we want to do is actually store a cookie. So we've already created the cookie functionality, but we're going to say cookie put, and we're going to say this cookie name. Now, where's this cookie name coming from? Well, that's the same thing as session name. No, well, not the same thing, but it's more or less, the same sort of concept. We just want to store the cookie name from the config. So in this case, it will be cookie / cookie _ name. So let's just refresh ourselves there. So it's, so it's remember cookie name. Oh. Okay, so we've now stored the cookie name, and we can set the cookie name. Let's just change that. So we can now set a cookie with the cookie name from our config file, just to keep things consistent. The hash as the value, and then config get remember / cookie expiry. So we're storing it for that amount of time, the expiry that we define in our config file. So now what's going to happen, let's just take a look at what's happened now. This isn't actually going to complete the functionality. We're very nearly done, so don't worry too much if this is confusing. It's not a lengthy thing to do, but it might be worth a review if you don't quite understand. So I'm going to log in as me. Now keep an eye on this sort of area here. If I log in without this, nothing much happens. I'll go ahead and log out again. If I log in now by checking this and click log in, you see that we've now got this hash value that's been stored here. So under cookies localhost, we get the PHP session ID, and we also get this hash that's been generated here, this long hash here. Now, if we look inside of our database, oh, it's not been stored. Let's take a look why. That's why. We need to define where we want to store this, so user session. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete this hash from our cookie set, log out, and we'll log back in. So now what should happen is this will be stored inside of our database, and it will be set as a cookie. So we set the hash here, and inside of our database, that's still not worked. Okay, let's just check what's happening here. Okay, so if we just check DB and go to, okay, so our insert method inside of our database wrapper, I left the users table as the thing that's inserted into. So not good at all. So if I go ahead and just replace this with table, we'll close that. Let's just take a look in the database to make sure nothing was inserted into users, which I have a feeling it hasn't. No, that's fine. So because then obviously them fields didn't exist. So let's pop back to users session, pop back to the site and delete the hash that is stored, and we'll go ahead and log in again. So Alex and password. Log in, hash, let me now. So Alex, password, remember me, log in, hash is generated here, and hash is stored in the database along with my user ID. Perfect, so this hash here matches this hash here. Now, how do we know that when we come back to this, that we're actually still going to be logged in or not? As it stands at the moment, if we closed our browser, shut down our PC and came back the next day, we definitely would not be logged in again. We wouldn't be logged in. What we need is when a user revisits the site, we need a way to determine whether or not they have this cookie available. If they do have the cookie available, we need to go ahead and look this up in the database table, return the user ID, and set this into a session to signify that they're signed in. So what we need to do is modify our initialization file to make use of the fact that every request to the application will potentially log a user in. So we want a check to say if cookie exists, config get remember cookie cookie name. So if this cookie actually exists, we want to check if a user is logged in or not as well. So we also want to say perhaps and session session exists. And we want to say if it doesn't exist, so if the user session doesn't exist, config get session name. So okay, let's go ahead and look at this. So let's echo out user asked to be remembered. So what we're going to do now is hit enter. We don't get that value back despite the fact that hash exists. If we delete the session but keep the hash, we're not logged in, but we are signifying that the user has asked to be remembered. So we now know that we need to grab that cookie value, look it up in the database, grab the user ID and log that user in by that user ID, because that token is unique to that user. So what we need to do here is we need to grab the or do a hash check. So we need to get the cookie first of all. So cookie get, and we obviously take this from the config. So the cookie name from the config. Config get remember cookie name. Now we're sort of repeating ourselves a little bit here, but let's not worry too much about that for now. So let's create a hash check to see if this actually exists. So let's say db get instance, and we'll say get from the users session table, and we want to get data where the hash is equal to the hash we just grabbed. So if hash check count hash matches log user in, so that's going to be our signifier to actually log a user in. So if I refresh, oh okay, it doesn't seem to match. Let's just check everything. Okay, something's gone a little wrong. So if hash check count user session hash equals hash check count, right, let's just go ahead and echo this hash out so we can see the value of it, and just compare that here. So that looks like they match, and in the database let's edit this, and it looks like that is cut off 53. Yes, so basically what's happened here is this is not large enough. So let's go ahead and add this as a 64 character field, and let's go ahead and delete the PHP session and the hash. We'll go ahead and log in. We'll signify that we want to be remembered, so we want to be remembered. Delete the PHP session, and now what's happening is, or it should be happening, there we go. So hash matches log user in. Now, if we were to change the value of this hash here, that would no longer be the case. This wouldn't. Unfortunately, I can't from the Chrome controls here. I can't actually modify this hash value. But if I were to modify this, you can in Firebug. If you're using Firefox, then we could modify this. But that's the point, really, that an attacker is never going to know if they want to log in as a particular user. They're never going to know what the hash is in the database. Security on this front can always be improved, but for now we're storing this hash, which does match the hash in the database here, and then we can log the user in. So let's go ahead now and do this. So here, instead of outputting that, we want to say user equals new user, hash check first user ID, because that's the user ID that's stored alongside the hash in the database here. So that'll be 4. So what we've now done is we've specified in our user object, when we instantiate it, that we do want a user. So what's now going to happen is we're actually going to find a user if it has been defined. And if we come down here, what we do is we find all the users' data, and then we're going to actually log this user in. So we found the user's data, and now we can say user login. So it's exactly the same as the login process. We're just doing it based on another user's ID. So now what's going to happen is when I refresh the page, oh, okay, so missing argument 3 for login. Okay, so we've not defined any of these. So let's go over to our user class. Okay, so remember, we'll say that's equal to false by default. So now we won't get this error. And this hash, we go back to index. Let's get rid of this. And let's get rid of this as well. Let's go ahead and log in. Remember me. Delete our PHP session. Hit enter. And oh, we're still not logged in. So let's just check these. Okay, right. Let's find out what might be going on here then. So let's echo out something here. Okay, so that doesn't appear to be logging us in. So let's just see what might be happening. So we're creating a new user object, hash check first user ID. Let's just go ahead and echo this out. And that should output 4. Lovely. So we know that we can now pass that into the user object. We're calling the login method. Not passing anything through because it should, if we go back, automatically do this. So login. Of course. Right. So what we're going to do now is this is something that I completely forgot to include. We're going to check if a username and password hasn't been defined, and check if the user actually exists or not. Now the reason we have to do this is because at the moment the login functionality, it's not doing anything to do with the user that's already logged in. So if we do a quick check here, and we say if blah 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 else, we'll put this here. So we want to indent this as well. And we want to return false down there. So what we're now going to do is, well, let's just check this. So if user return true, otherwise want to return false. Yes, we want to return false by default. Okay, so what we're now doing is, if we've not passed in any username or any password, we want to log the user in automatically if that user exists. So we want to say if no username's been defined and no password has been defined and this exists, meaning this user exists, then we want to log user in. And we want to log the user in by the data ID. Now this exists, we don't actually have at the moment, but all we want to do to determine whether they exist or not is if we have retrieved data from them or from a user at some point. So the exists function is basically just going to check whether the data exists in this data array. So we're going to say return not empty this data, then true, otherwise false. So we're checking if a username and password hasn't been defined. In this case, when we are doing this, it hasn't been defined, and this will automatically, create this data array for us. So this exists will be true. In that case, then we just want to automatically set a session for the user. So that's easily done. We just put a session. So session put, and in here we want to just say this session name. We've already defined this. And then because we have access to this data that we've already accumulated based on doing this, we can just log that user in. Okay, it's a little complicated, but it's one of them things. So when I refresh now, okay, unexpected public, used up PHP line 84. There we are. Sorry, I forgot an ending bracket. So little syntax error there. So when I press enter now, it's logged me in. So if I log myself out, I'm always going to stay logged in because the hash exists. If I get rid of the hash, I hit enter, I'm still logged in. But if I get rid of the PHP session this time, I'm logged out. So now what's happening is the hash is going through, it's generating everything. And it means that now when we return, as long as this hash is generated and it matches the one in a database, this is always going to return 4 and then log that user in based on the ID of 4. Now there's one more thing we need to do just quickly before we wrap things up here. And that is we need to modify the logout functionality, because at the moment when we log out, nothing, we can't really log out because we're not deleting this hash. We're automatically being logged in because that's the point of the remember me functionality. So if we go down to the logout functionality here, not only do we want to delete this session, we also want to delete the cookie. So this cookie name. Now, that's not all we want to delete. We also want to remove it from the database as well. So we're going to say this db delete. I mean, we could keep the same hash for each user. But if an attacker ever found that hash by any means, we would then be in trouble because we want to regenerate the hash every time a user logs in. So by a user logging out and logging back in, they've refreshed their hash. So we want to delete from user session where user ID equals this data ID. Okay, so now that's going to delete where that's the current logged in ID. So when we log out, we actually now log out, delete the hash from our cookie, and we also delete this from the database. And then when we go ahead and log in again, it does exactly the same thing, generates the hash here, even if the session is expired, we still log ourselves in, we still keep this in the database. When we log out, they've both gone again. So a little bit more complex functionality than we've already seen, but this will now allow us to provide the user with the ability to stay signed in.